God bless. This is NFL-Moneyball, brought to you by NFL ESP, or Extended Strategic Principles, found on the web at NFL-ESP.com. I am your host, Mark Anthony DeBello. You can find more information on me and this program by going to my website, markanthonydebello.com, and clicking on the Sports tab. Today is Saturday, October the 24th. This is going to be a half-hour program broken up into basically three segments. The first will be covering the games from an NFL ESP unique perspective, and then how that equates to those who might have an interest in Nevada, and then lastly to those who might have an interest in fantasy football. Again, the goal is to reach a wider audience. I admittedly am not being as professional as I normally might be if this were to be broadcast on a national radio or television network, or at least with a wider audience on the internet. However, it doesn't mean that the information I give you is anything less than prophetic, productive, and predictive, which is basically what NFL ESP does in covering games from the motivational, the spiritual, X's and O's, and strategic information, especially using our unique use of a number we call the power spread. Keeping in mind, again, that is a number that is more accurate, more refined than a different or similar number, also called a spread, which is disseminated throughout Nevada. But again, that number is skewed so that those who have a financial interest in games will lose. Again, wholeheartedly, I always say we, meaning God and I, believe in the integrity of the NFL and believe that people don't need to be necessarily putting money on games. But it doesn't mean that the data that's mined out of Las Vegas isn't the most accurate analytical data available today, and it is. Now, in relation to that, and again, you're going to hear this program broken up into three segments from the games from the NFL ESP perspective, and we're going to do a little bit of a recap from last week and a seasonal overview, and then the games coming up this week, and you'll see how perhaps even just the difference in the number might be beneficial to those who want to put money on games in Nevada. When I say that, what I mean is, for example, let's say you have a favorite who we know is only supposed to be giving 7 points, but instead has to give 10 or 11 with the number that they use in Nevada. That might be a cause for you to invest, if you will, on the underdog. So that's how this information is very valuable to those who have that kind of interest, and even especially in the fantasy realm, which is no less than really a word I hate to use, begins with a G, gambling. Okay, you won't hear me use that word again throughout this broadcast. But even now in Las Vegas, they've recently passed a ruling that players in Las Vegas or people aren't allowed to play fantasy. There's a couple reasons for that. One is because fantasy football is doing so well and making so much money, and the gaming industry in Las Vegas or Nevada isn't too keen about that because it's not one of their companies. The two main ones are DraftKings and FanDuel. So Las Vegas wants to try to put the kibosh, if you will, on that and get their share of the profits. So they've thus made it, in their mind, it's illegal. Secondly, which, again, the hardest thing about getting the NFL ESP program, I think, to teams, and I don't just mean Moneyball, this program designed for the media or as a audio or video tutorial to teams as a part of a service or a consultation, but to just get the product itself, the NFL ESP product, which has been proven to increase a team's win production by at least 10 to 15% in the pros and more than that in college, is that people have a fear of Las Vegas, and I understand that. I believe in the integrity of the NFL and the game, and that the two should not meet. But again, ultimately they probably will one day. But even now, the NFL is very pro, if you will, or they're a proponent of fantasy football. They encourage it. You see advertising in relation to it, whether it's DraftKings or FanDuel, and that's no less than the G word. Okay, so I'm not saying that the NFL is hypocritical. What I'm saying is that it's a shame from the NFL ESP perspective here, where I'm speaking, that they can't be more openly, even though I have gotten interviews, as I've mentioned, and have had some opportunities, that teams can't quite understand the value. The power spread especially when it comes to basic strategy for teams, is the least understood and most undervalued number or analytical data that there is out there. And again, when it comes or is relayed in conjunction through a GMC or a game management coordinator to a head coach during a game at basically 10 or 11 or 12 what I call points of call, or key moments in a game when the coach has to make the most probable and productive strategy decision, they don't have the proper data. I just saw the game on Thursday night, San Francisco and Seattle. Seattle's basically a 6-point favorite in San Francisco, which means if you give San Francisco basically 3 points for being at home, they're basically 9 points less than Seattle, which gives them less than a 25% chance to win the game. And yet on 2 fourth-down opportunities, trailing in the game, Coach Tomasulo, who I actually kind of like from what I can see, made the wrong basic strategy calls, and basically in one case went for a field goal, and then in the other just punted the ball instead of going on for a fourth down late in the game. And one of the worst prognosticators and announcers in all of football is Phil Simms, arrogant and just disrespectful of everybody but himself, basically. He's just so wishy-washy with what he thinks. He said, oh, that's the right thing, and he used some logic, which was absurd to me. He said, listen, San Francisco knows this is when they were going for the field goal, and they were trailing something like, 20-something to nothing. And he said, well, you know what? It's better just to get points on the board and lose by less, because San Francisco knows Seattle's going to win the game. San Francisco's already knows that they lost the game. They might as well just get points on board. That's ludicrous. It was early in the game, and anybody who concedes victory that early in the game, and anybody who, lies with that mentality, it's just ludicrous, to be honest with you. So, regardless of that, the right decision, even statistically, was to go for a touchdown. So, or at least go on that fourth down and try to get a touchdown. But having said that, let me move on. We're about 8 minutes into the program. Let me go over last week a little bit, and then where we stand on the season perspective. And again, covering things, this week's games from the more of an NFL ESP perspective than a Nevada perspective, and then again, I'll devote some time to fantasy at the end of this. So let's move on. Last week, we liked New Orleans against Atlanta. They were aggressive in their decisions, which they needed to be. In this rivalry game, we figured New Orleans would beat Atlanta. Now, I do like Atlanta this year, and I know from a fantasy perspective, Freeman, the running back, is doing phenomenally well. I actually played fantasy the first week and won a tournament because I liked Julio Jones in Atlanta's first game, and he did well. So I like Atlanta, but bear in mind, Atlanta is playing above what their power rating is. Okay, they might be 5-0 now, but that's really they're in a weak division, probably the second weakest division in the NFL, if not surely the NFC, with the NFC East being the weakest division. So it's a sort of it's a skewed or misrepresentative of 5-1. Atlanta is now. So they might not even. I don't even have them in the playoffs, to be honest with you. That's going to mean they're going to level out probably somewhere around 8-8, or maybe even 9-7, 7-9, and miss the playoffs. So again, as good a team as they are and as improved as they are, The power spread data doesn't quite match on Atlanta. Cincinnati, I always underrate, but apparently they're a pretty darn good team this year. And I think in our prognostications at the beginning of the year, as much as I was against them, I think I have them in the final against, it's going to be New England against Cincinnati, I think, as wild cards. I thought Buffalo would be in there, but there are too many injuries, and I think they're going to play well defensively this week, Buffalo. But if New England wins that division now, they won't be a wild card. But Cincinnati should get in the playoffs one way or another and could vie for the AFC Championship against New England, if not Indy. That's who I actually have. I have New England against Indy and then Arizona against Green Bay. And I'm truly confident it's going to be Arizona against Green Bay. But this, again, much like baseball this year, is a really tough year to discern everything in the NFL. So let me go a little bit back again to last week. Denver over Cleveland. Denver, good defense. Offense, everybody knows, isn't performing as well. Cleveland, Hoyer's been doing well, but I still like Johnny Manziel. You've heard me rant about that for I can't tell you how long. Detroit actually should have beat Chicago by a little bit more than 3 points. Because of turnovers, it was only a 37-34 Detroit victory. I got to be honest, I thought Detroit would do a lot better this year, and I have them as a playoff team. I still think perhaps they can get there. It might be mathematically, really, I don't want to give you all the numbers because I haven't really, deciphered them, but Detroit is, might just almost at some point shortly here be mathematically almost eliminated, but it's still really early, believe me. This NFL, you're going to see a lot of 9 and 7 division winners, even some 8 and 8s, and like I said, in the NFC East, you're going to see a 7 and 9 division winner. Houston played Jacksonville. Houston won. That game was a lot closer because of turnovers. We had it as a 50-50 game, and it probably was that game. And neither of those teams are really good quality teams. Kansas City played Minnesota. Minnesota, like I said, at the beginning of the year, I heard people like them at the Hall of Fame game, so I didn't like them. But after doing some data, and I like to use the word, this is the silver state out here in Nevada, mining the data. But Minnesota actually, I think, could be a playoff team, at least definitely a wild card. They're not going to win that division. They're not going to beat Green Bay, but they actually have a very good defense. Minnesota. Bridgewater, I think, is low rated, and you can't go wrong with Adrian Peterson. But they've got to use him correctly. And make him not do as much as he thinks he probably needs to do, because they actually have a pretty good defense. Kansas City struggling. Andy Reid, overrated, always has been overrated. No disrespect to Coach Reid. I'd love to work for Kansas City and talk to their player personnel person who might be their GM, and I really appreciate him, although he never got back to me. But they could definitely use our help. They always settle for too many field goals, Kansas City, and they have really no clue of what the power sprint is when they analyze or strategize their games. The Jets didn't play their best game, but beat the NFC East team, Washington. Again, had an interview with the Jets. Surprised they're doing as well as they're doing, but then again, I knew they would be better than they were last year, only because of not necessarily that Coach Ryan's a negative, but the turmoil and the tumult that they had. And not surprised, and getting Geno Smith out of there was the best thing to ever happen to the Jets quarterback, especially from the quarterback perspective. So the Jets beat Washington. That wasn't a surprise. I was totally, I got to be honest, surprised that Pittsburgh beat Arizona. I've been underrating Pittsburgh. They're a pretty good team. Arizona, I still think, is the NFC, maybe even Super Bowl representative to beat Green Bay. But surprised that they lost at Pittsburgh. Miami, which was expected when they got a new coach in, not anything against Coach Philbin, and I don't know that this Coach Campbell's the long-term solution, but a coaching change is huge in the NFL, and you see it. One of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing, and I always say this, basically the mantra of NFL ASP when it comes to a team is, and it goes like this, quote, "The team that wins is a team that wants to win," end quote. Want being the key word. Heart always beats talent. Okay, heart always beats mind. You can be the smartest player and the most talented player, but if you don't really want to win, if it's not in your heart, if you're not playing to die basically out there on that field, you won't win. So motivation was huge for the NFL, for professionals, whether it's called bulletin board material or whatnot. And the second thing I want to make a key dramatic note about that I'm glad God, thank you, Lord, brought to my mind is the other thing you have to realize in the NFL, and this is where the media comes into play, and you've heard me talk about the media from an officiating perspective where it's huge and not enough coaches use it. There was one coach last week I heard he really came out against the media and said we're getting bad calls, and he's really smart to do that, to be honest with you. And I think then he got really positive calls when they were at home. I can't remember the coach, but and I don't want to give away all that strategy here on home field advantage, how that works, and it could be up to 7 points in a game. But the point I really wanted to make is that the more you hear the media especially, or anybody, coaches, players, anything broadcast, the more you hear it, it's really the opposite of what comes to pass. For instance, if somebody says a team is great and this team's great and they're playing well and this player says we're the best, and you know what, God won't tolerate that, okay? And that your spoken word is the most powerful thing a human being has, along with their free will choice. So when that word goes out there, it's almost as if Satan steals it and the opposite comes to pass, which is why humility and being humble is so important. Also, keep in mind, when you hear people talk a lot of negative things, for instance, this week, how bad the Buffalo defense is, or that there's, turmoil over there. I really think now you're going to see the Buffalo defense play very well on Sunday against Jacksonville in London. But that's, you can all just listen to the media, especially ESPN. They have the most, God bless them. I would love to work for ESPN, believe me, don't get me wrong. But if I had my druthers, I would rather work for Fox or the NFL Network, which I don't know why. I don't understand why they don't want the truth and insight that's never been heard before. But nonetheless, that ESPN, their broadcasters are the worst prognosticators possible. They're just horrific. Not all of them, most of them. But anyway, having said that, when you hear people saying how good this team is or how they're expected to win, it's going to be the opposite, and vice versa. If you hear, them, berating some team or, downplaying some team, expect that team to turn it around, and not only from a spiritual perspective, but from a motivational perspective. Players hear that, they respond to what people are saying, and especially the media, and that's, whether, like I said, that's bulletin board material or whatnot. So, anyway, having said that, my point was about motivation and getting a new coach. So that helped Miami, and I think will probably help Miami this week as well. But again, Miami is not that good a team. Carolina defeated Seattle. We actually predicted that. The power spread out here was 6.5. That wasn't the actual power spread. That was the other spread. Our data had it less than that, which we knew if you had, put your huckles on Carolina, you would have won, and they won straight up. And I'll make a fantasy note here, which was key. I keyed Greg Olsen, and I want to give you all the reasons why, but I knew that as an underdog, you wanted to go to the two top scoring players if the underdog looks like they're going to win the game, because it'll surprise most of your competition. And the two on Carolina are obviously Olsen and Cam Newton. And then what you also have to realize is if you're the quarterback and you're playing a better team, typically you can't really get it to your number one receiver. Either he's double teamed or they put their best DB on him. So then you got to check down to either the second wide out or even the tight end. And there's rare exceptions to that. Like if you're a real tight end oriented team, or you have like a Jimmy Graham or an Olsen, somebody like that, where they really throw to the tight end a lot, or especially Gronkowski on the Patriots, then the tight end is either the first or second choice. But again, your first wide receiver, and this is again a fantasy note, your first wide receiver is only the really best player to pick when your team is a clear-cut favorite that's going to win the game, and a game that's determined to go over. I also knew that a lot of people were thinking that game was going to be low-scoring or quote-unquote under game. So again, it was just a blessed opportunity to take Olsen, and he scored, I think, something like 37 fantasy points, which is a lot of points in that kind of competition. San Diego kept Green Bay close. San Diego doing a little bit better than I thought this year. I had Kansas City. I had it actually 50-50 at the beginning of the year. Excuse me, who would come, second in the Denver division there out in the west of the AFC. But actually, San Diego could nip Kansas City now for second. San Francisco defeated Baltimore. Baltimore, Coach Trestman, that team, God bless him. I love him, but they should have really, I should be there with Mr. Bisciotti, the owner. I should have talked to him instead of everybody else on the team that I talked to. I love all you guys, but I talked to the team pastor, Johnny Shelton. I've known Coach Trestman 30 years, actually really intensely the last 10 or 12. Even Mr. Cass, all of them. I don't know how else I can help them. I just should have went to Mr. Bisciotti and said, listen, here's what's going to happen. You can win with me. You're going to lose 2-3 games without me. So they could really use the NFL ESP help. But anyway, they lost to Frisco mostly because of turnovers. But Baltimore, again, and you typically see this when you look at the records, teams, you can break the season down into 3 segments, basically, three thirds, 3 periods. The first 5 games, the middle 5 games, and the last 5 games. So teams that are 5-0 at the beginning of the season typically will end the season with a good one-loss record, and the teams that have a bad one-loss record, let's say Baltimore, who's whatever they are now, 1-5 or whatever they are. Let me look real quick. Yeah, 1-5. Teams that start out like 0-5, they'll win their middle section of games and do well, and then at the end of the season they revert back to where they were, sort of a bell curve. There'll be exceptions to that. 32 teams. There'll be one that continually just keeps winning. Maybe they go like 5-0, 4-1, 4-1, something like that. And I know there's 16 games. I'm just giving you, rounding it off here. And then, like I said, with losing teams, they'll start out 0-5, then they'll win the middle games, and they'll end up 0-5. So, anyways, Baltimore is that kind of team. I think they'll do well here in the middle of the season. There's a couple other teams like that. Kansas City, Baltimore are playing beneath their records. The Lions definitely are playing beneath their record. And teams are playing above their record, teams like Atlanta, even Carolina in that division. Who else? Maybe Cincinnati a little bit, Denver for sure, and then I think the Jets also mellow out here a little bit, so to speak. So anyway, let's go back and wrap up the thing last week because we've got to get to this week. Indy and the Pats played a close game as we suspected. I think they might even be your AFC finalists. And then in a game, I could have told you this. All you had to do was listen from the beginning of June or July. The NFC East is the worst division in football. The Eagles are probably one of the worst teams in football, along with the Giants. They're both completely overrated. They played just a sloppy game. That you're going to get that in the NFC East. And how this game gets on Monday Night Football, I'll never know. Okay? Boring, blowout, lousy, bad football. And one of the things I'd like to do if I can get to the MIT Analytics Conference is just tell these networks you need to use NFL ESP to help you to put on the best games, the most exciting, the most productive. The games that are closest, the games that have the best players, games that have the most meaning. It's going to increase viewership. But well, anyway, so let's get to this week. Enough of last week, and let me run down this schedule in the last 8 or 6 minutes or so we have here. Already talked about the Seattle-San Francisco game. Seattle playoff team, yes, not as good as years previous, and like I said, they won't be in the Super Bowl this year. Buffalo and Jacksonville, these are 2 bad teams. Buffalo, I don't want to say they're bad. I think Buffalo is actually a playoff team. I don't know how they're not there yet. A lot of injuries, but they should beat Jacksonville even with all their injuries in what would probably be a low-scoring game. If you're Jacksonville, you got to take chances, Jacksonville. You got to do much more than what you're doing. You don't realize how bad you are. Cleveland and St. Louis, these are 2 mediocre teams. St. Louis is better than average. Cleveland, you've heard me already talk about. Cleveland's the power spread underdog in that game. A lot of people are investing in St. Louis. If you're Cleveland, you got to be aggressive, Coach. I don't. I mean, I could really straighten out Cleveland. I see all the pieces there. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's going to turn out to be a beautiful picture. All the pieces are there, but they can't really put the puzzle together. They've got piece here, piece there, but they're all pretty pieces. And I'm right now what I'm equating that to is their strategy decisions, just not not on. Kansas City and Pittsburgh is a toss-up game. As I said, Mike Vick is doing a good job filling in with with Ben Roethlisberger, and again, that's mostly because on third down, which is the key down. Any coach will tell you, but it's what the quarterback does to be productive with rushing yards on third down that really makes a difference in games, and Vic is definitely better than Big Ben. But Kansas City should win that game, as I mentioned, with the schedule reversal type of situation. Miami, I think, can win this one also with the new coaching change, and then they'll revert back to being a poor team because Houston's not that good a team. And that power spread, Miami needs to get home calls. That's a little bit inflated, that number. So if you're investing, you probably want to invest in Houston. The Jets and Patriots are close every year. That's a big power spread. If you're going to invest in a game, you might as well take the points. The Jets are going to play them tough, I suspect, but New England is definitely, I looked at the schedule pretty closely, or at least the data I have, New England is definitely the better team than the Jets. I can't see them losing that game, which anybody could tell you. I mean, they're almost a double-digit power spread favorite. I think the Lions are going to actually defeat the Vikings. I'm hoping and praying that they do. I played them in contests and fantasy, and keyed one of their fantasy players. I don't want to say which one, but again, the Vikings are a good team. They could win that game. Here's an upset, I think, even with Mettenberger in there, Tennessee over Atlanta. As I mentioned, Atlanta's a little bit overrated. I know a lot of people are investing in Atlanta. I would take Tennessee, but Tennessee, know this: you don't get a lot of home field advantage in Tennessee. They're in Nashville. I've seen their games. They're just not a loud crowd in a sense, and I don't think they influence the refs. They're just, and it's tough when you've got a team with a lot of publicity that's having an undefeated season like Atlanta they haven't lost now, but, team that gets a lot of hype. The refs give them those psychologically biased calls. I saw it last week especially. I can't remember the game. And you could hear the announcers. It was a national TV game. Like, geez, you can just see the calls these refs make. They lean toward the home team. It's period. That's all it is. That's mostly what home field advantage is, and it needs to be worked in the sense that, to a team's advantage. The Colts are playing the Saints. The Colts are coming around. The Saints got their motivational win. I can't see the Colts losing this game. The Raiders are primed to upset the Chargers. The Chargers, you can hear them say, and a lot of people are investing in the Chargers, which tells me you want to like the Raiders. But from power spread perspective, the Chargers are an NFL ESP point of view. The Chargers are kicking too many field goals. And it's not only because their offense, for lack of parlance, they break down in the red zone. If you don't want to make a lot of field goals, then don't go for them. Don't kick them. Go for touchdowns. Now, what you're seeing is San Diego getting a lot of yards, but their points aren't matching their yardage or the differentials there, and they can see that and realize that, and there's more to it than I can explain here in this short amount of time. But again, anything really 4th and 5, 4th and 4 or less, anywhere from inside the 35, you got to be going for that. Okay, I always disdain the punt, the short punt that you have to hope lands, at the 10 or inside, but or the middle range field goal. I like long field goals, 50 or over, or you're going for it. That's really the philosophy that teams need to have. That's in the end, in the long run, the most productive philosophy. So we only got a minute here, so I'm gonna have to fire this out, and I threw fantasy in. So the Cowboys actually beat the Giants by more than they did in the first week, but because of turnovers, the game is closer. The quarterback change, I know, benefits the Cowboys because Tony Romo isn't in there. And the Giants, they do get some home calls there, but these are two bad teams. Expect the same kind of game you saw last week with Philly and the Giants. The Eagles are playing the Panthers. The Panthers are a tad bit overrated from the power spread perspective, but they should definitely beat the Eagles, especially in Carolina, because the Eagles get a huge home field advantage when they're in Philly. And those, like I said, they're the most overrated team in the NFL this year. Atlanta's playing Baltimore. I can't see Baltimore upsetting Atlanta, regrettably. Arizona, I'm sorry. And Arizona, like I said, is an NFL, NFC finalist, and it is in Arizona. So if you're Baltimore, you just better take a lot of chances. You better really pull out all the stops. You're going to need them in Arizona on a Monday night. Anyway, that's it for now, okay? God bless all of you who listen. This has been NFL ESP, or brought to you by NFL ESP. It's NFL Moneyball. I'm Mark Anthony DeBello. I've been your host. Thank you, and God bless you.